Welcome to Health, Wellbeing and Lifestyle, where professionals in the field inform, educate and inspire the community to be healthier, more balanced and live the lifestyle they love. And today we have Caroline Pope in the studio. She's an animal communicator and therapist, and we are going to be talking about the art of animal communication. Welcome, Caroline.
Thank you. It's lovely to be here.
Yeah, it's lovely to have you. Now, can anybody communicate with animals?
Absolutely. We are all born with the ability to communicate. Communication is telepathics. Tele is distance, pathics is feeling. So essentially it's feeling over a distance. We're all born with the ability. A mother takes her baby into the hospital and says there's something wrong with my baby. The doctors and nurses always listen because most of the time there is. Identical twins, one just knowing what the other's doing, that's been documented throughout history. It's all telepathics. But of course, from the baby's perspective, unless it's actually dying, telepathics really don't get validated. Then the child says its first word, mom or dad or whatever. Everyone makes a fuss. So the child learns verbalizing gets my needs met, telepathics not so much. Then they get that bit older and they might say the pony's got a stomach ache or the dog's got a headache. And often parents will either punish the child for lying or make fun of them. Don't be silly, horses can't talk. So of course you start shutting down on one and building up on the other. And telepathics is like any muscle. You don't use it, you lose it.
And how can we communicate with animals?
Clear mind, always a good thing. People that meditate, I don't, often find that helpful. Water's really important because you're using your energetic field. It's electromagnetic. Think of the snowy hydro scheme. The more water you drink, the easier it is. As a coffee addict, I really struggled with that in the beginning. But also don't start with your own animals. Start with someone else's because you need to remain detached in order to know what you're getting is from that particular animal and not from yourself. It's like doctors don't treat their own children. Clairvoyants never read for themselves. You need that detachment, particularly when you're starting, and you also need honest feedback so you know whether you're on the right track or not.
Do you have any examples of animal communication that you could share?
Absolutely. Very first, when I'd read the book, I actually started by reading a book back in the mid-90s called, surprise, surprise, Communicating with Animals by a guy called Arthur Myers, who was a journalist. Went down the horse paddock and the first horse I saw told me it wanted clean water. I looked in the trough, there was nothing there. I spent 2.5 years working every day, giving myself the migraine from hell quite often before I got anything else. And every time that horse walked by me, if he was on the lead rope, he'd plant his feet, stop and eyeball me. I'd love to know what the poor guy was trying to get through. Never got through anything again. One horse I worked with, the owner had called me as a last resort. The horse twice a year would blow up massively with fluid. It was down at the Werribee Vet School. It actually had to have a tracheotomy to keep breathing. That's how much fluid we're talking. They were feeding it bananas by the dozen because they were having to give it so much Frutix or furosemide diuretics to get rid of the fluid that it was losing all its potassium. They were going to euthanize it. Again, this was before internet. She literally pulled out a whole trolley full of vet notes. Started talking with the mare and the first thing she showed me was her foal and then said problems been since then. And the owners went, oh my God, she's never come back in season since she had the foal. And then they realised that the twice a year she was having the problem was actually when horses come in season twice a year. And it was when this was happening. A craniosacral therapy session from, this was before I did it, from the lovely Deb Lee, and a couple of bottles of she oak, the Australian bushflower essence, and the mare never had a problem again. Craniosacral therapy was derived from osteopathy, I think about 35, 40 years ago, but don't quote me on the dates. There was a couple of different people that discovered it, but basically your cranio is your cranium, sacral is your sacrum. The craniosacral rhythm can be felt anywhere on the body. You've got your heart rate, you've got your respiratory rate, you've got your cranial rhythm. CST as it's called, craniosacral, CST for short, much easier for most people, works on the limbic system in the brain, so the emotional part of the brain. The most pressure you're putting on a body is literally that of a 5-cent piece. And then it's basically that whole doing and non-doing. The body's got its own wisdom. It knows what it needs. And quite often what a practitioner thinks the body needs versus what the body actually needs is a little bit like the Montagues and the Capulets. So you're simply allowing the body to unwind. And that's what I love about it. You'll have physical releases. You'll have emotional releases. Animals can process for 2 to 3 days afterwards. And the results really are profound. And yet it's so gentle you can do it on a newborn.
And could you give us some tips on how we can communicate with animals?
Think of, for most people, I think they find the proverbial thought bubble. You know, the little cartoon bubbles, putting a thought in there and throwing it at the animal. And whatever you get back first, that very instantaneous, that's communication. Quite often when I'm talking with an animal, the owner will get as far as, did he, do they? I've already got the answer, yes or no, because a thought is instantaneous. Trying to put words to something, particularly if it's an important concept, can take you a second or two. And of course, the thoughts being so instantaneous, it's trust your gut. That's the biggest thing. And whatever comes into your mind first, don't try and do the logical right brain versus left brain argument. You only wind up with a headache. Trust that gut. Whatever you get instantaneously and first is right. Every time.
Caroline, thank you so much for joining us. That was fascinating. If you want more information on Caroline Pope and the art of animal communication, head to her webpage on our website, healthwellbeingandlifestyle.com.au. Stay with us after the break, another interesting guest with an exciting topic.
Stay tuned. After the break, urban food specialist Marc Noyce is talking about innovative systems that make gardening easier. Welcome back. Our second guest today is urban food specialist Marc Noyce, and the topic we'll be discussing is innovative systems that make gardening easier. Welcome, Marc.
Hi Megan, thank you very much for having me.
Gardening's come a long way. What are some of the latest trends?
Well, let's look at where gardening came from. Where we grew plants in broad acre farming, which we still do. We've been doing that for thousands of years, and it's got us to where we are today, which is fantastic. But most of our population lives in urban cities. We live near the coast, and we congregate in an urban jungle, basically, and we don't have access to those same broad acre farms. We're actually building over our traditional food bowls as fast as humanly possible. So here in Melbourne, for example, our food comes more than 100 kilometres from where we're sitting right now, every day of the week. So we've got to bring in food now from a long distance, and in some cases, some of our food travels thousands of kilometres to get to it. We call that food miles. What we're trying to do is turn food miles into food meters by growing our own food in our backyard or on our balcony. So food has come a long way in terms of how we grow. There are lots of different ways to grow food, and some of the challenges are, how do we do that in an urban environment?
Marc, you've talked about the wicking garden beds a little bit. Can you tell us a little bit more about those?
So a wicking garden bed is not just like a garden bed in your backyard or a pot, for example. In your backyard, you might have a raised garden bed. It might just be at soil level where you grow some food. You put water on there, and quite often that water just goes straight through the garden bed, past the roots, and you're actually watering next door neighbour's trees instead. You put your nutrients on there. You buy some nutrients from the hardware store or the supermarket, and you pour those nutrients on, and they again go straight past your plants, your seedlings, and make your next door neighbour's trees look really fantastic. Gets into the groundwater and it's gone. In a pot, for example, where you pour water on there, it just goes down the sides and you think you've watered your pot, but if you actually break that apart, you'll find that it's really dry. And because when potting mix dries out, it doesn't attract water anymore. So what we want to do is we want to try to hold that water in the pot. So self-watering pots are just a really fantastic way of having a water reservoir in the bottom of the pot and allowing that water to rise up through the potting mix as the plant needs it 24/7. And we call that a wicking garden bed, where if you've ever had a dishcloth in water, you might notice that it rises up out of the water as it travels up the dishcloth. That's called capillary action, it's called wicking, and it's how water can travel up from a water reservoir up through the potting mix and then be available to the plant or the seedlings or whatever you're growing in there whenever that plant needs it. And it just does it naturally. So as it's being drawn up from the bottom through capillary action, a plant reaches down with its roots and sucks it up through suction. So when suction meets wicking, you've got a very happy plant. So a wicking garden bed is a containerised, sealed system that is perched above the water in the soil, so that we're holding that where the plants are for later. Because when it rains, we get a lot of excess rain in our urban environments, and a wicking garden bed captures that in its space for later reuse. So it's very climate adaptive. We can get through a lot of heat waves, and in some cases we can get our plants to survive for weeks at a time in the one containerised system. Let's look at a wicking garden bed. Its elements are: there's a sealed container, there's a water reservoir in the base, which is generally rock, then there's a geotextile layer to separate the rock and the water from the potting mix, then we put our potting mix on top, and then we plant in that, and the water wicks up through capillary action into the potting mix to allow the plants to grow. That's how a wicking garden bed works, or a self-watering pot plant works. There are some advances now where these wicking garden beds have a water reservoir with cones and an air gap between the water and the potting mix, so that we can have free draining and wicking at the same time. And that prevents root rot. You don't want root rot in a container because it goes pretty smelly actually. So by getting a little bit of oxygen, you allow the water to move up through the potting mix, you allow the potting mix to breathe, and I like oxygen and so do plants. So they like to breathe too. Allowing them to breathe gets it much healthier. Allowing the plants to breathe lets them grow more optimally. And so you're going to get the best out of your garden bed if you've got a wicking garden bed that can breathe.
That's fantastic information, Marc. So Marc, what's some advice for our audience in creating their own urban garden bed?
Megan, setting up your own urban garden is actually quite easy. With a wicking garden bed, for example, you can avoid losing all your water, you can avoid having roots come into it from your next door neighbour's trees. You can actually make it very ergonomic by getting it up off the ground and having that raised garden bed so that you're not bending and hurting your back when you're watering or tending to your garden. You can set up an urban farm really quickly these days by having a connectable modular garden bed system that takes the hard work out of gardening. Imagine coming home on a hot day and then you see your garden bed just wilting and dying because you haven't been there to water it. Well, a wicking garden bed solves that. A wicking garden bed gives the plants exactly what it needs 24/7. So certain types of plants can access water all the time versus others that don't like a lot of water can just take what they need, and just more comes up naturally through a wicking garden bed.
Wow, that's fantastic information there, Marc. Thank you. If you'd like to know more about Marc and the innovative systems that make gardening easier, go to his webpage on our website, healthwellbeingandlifestyle.com.au, and after the break we'll have another interesting guest and another interesting topic.
Stay tuned. After the break, health, life and love coach Belle Murphy is talking about the secrets of long-lasting love. Welcome back. Today we have Heather Belle Murphy on the show, a health, life and love coach, and our topic is the secrets of long-lasting love. Welcome to the show, Heather, and tell us, how many secrets are there?
There's actually quite a few, Kirsty, which I'm sure you can appreciate. If I can offer some great advice, as a bit of a mentor and being pretty seasoned in love myself, love is a skill like anything, you know, and I think there's been a cultural perception, or some of us who may have been raised with a religious overtone, and certainly I had an early Christian upbringing, that love just, you know, it's just this thing that comes naturally. So I've certainly grown up through relationships and I've gotten better at it. And, you know, there are obviously some skills which are really important to create a sustainable, loving life. And then, you know, a long-lasting, juicy, vital, fun, passionate, romantic relationship. Number one is definitely to fall in love with yourself first and to know your strengths and identify your weaknesses. Now, if you know that you've got a really flaky, bad habit, for example, being bad with money, that's probably something which you prefer to address sooner rather than later, because that's one of those things that can make sustainable love tricky. A great saying is, when financial hardship comes through the front door, love tends to fly out the window. So that's one thing. You know, it's like being aware of what your strengths and weaknesses are, and if you can, address those weaknesses. Or it's something that can be shared with a partner, you know, because maybe you don't carry the financial reins in the relationship. Perhaps, you know, that's a job for the partner. It's something that a particular person is poor in. Another thing is, so along with that self-love, is identify your partner's strengths and weaknesses. This is a really common, actually it's almost like we're entering the time with all the online dating, you know, and the Tinder love. It's almost like entering the menu log love stage, where relationships are starting and finishing, you know, within a few hours. So there is definitely learning dating skills for women in particular, and this was a big mistake, was that I didn't give myself permission to identify who I really wanted to be with. I tended to let the other person just choose me and then go along with it. And so I would end up in relationships where I was obviously with the wrong person. And then being young and naive and, you know, lacking skill in that area and thinking that love was unconditional, which is a really big thing for women, I would be trying to make a bad match work. And then thinking, you know, I need to just work harder at it. It was actually just that I was with the wrong person all along, because it was all a hormone driven, you know, that friction of, you know, passion and physicality, but really the long-term juice just wasn't there, and it was actually never there to start with. So there is a thing about giving yourself permission to choose, knowing what your strengths are, knowing what you like.
Heather, does unconditional love exist?
I would answer probably no, especially when it comes to intimate, sustainable, you know, long-term love. Because this comes down to house training, you know, which is about doing our part in the relationship. You're probably not looking at a long-term love picture if somebody thinks that it's okay to just, you know, sit on the couch and eat chocolate. You know, it's probably not part of a sustainable long love picture. So definitely the role where, you know, and it's part of a healthy love life plan for, you know, whatever an end result looks like in a relationship. So people are going to play their parts.
And what tips do you have for our audience?
Definitely, I would say have a love plan together, you know, and make time for each other. So, You know, I find it quite a common thing that when people have been in a relationship for a few years, they can get into the pattern of taking each other for granted, which may look like there's never date night. You know, there's never date night for intimacy. It's not planned. There is also that plan of that end result about who you want to be in the relationship and then how your relationship is going to look like. I love receiving flowers. I think it's an incredibly sensual and sexy act. And so, you know, he gives me roses on a regular basis. Bit of a surprise in there, which is really nice. So it's never like it's a spontaneous Tuesday every week because he set a calendar to it or something. You know, but it's a really lovely surprise. However, I've got friends. Now that was part of my juicy fantasy little movie that I played out in here before we met that now projects out here. I've got friends who don't like holding hands, don't like getting flowers. You know, they think, what's the point of receiving something that's going to be dead in a week? So that's not part of their plan, which is fine. So they've got a different plan. So of course, it all depends on choosing what we like to start with and then being capable of receiving it. Now, women receiving is a massive, massive secret and also gift to a man. I've got friends, and I've got those kinds of Facebook friends where they'll be posting, you know, when a man loves a woman, he'll give her this and, you know, hold her and do this. And then they can't receive a cup of coffee or they can't receive the offer of a ride home. So receiving for women, which goes into our self-love, being the fountain of love, not the well of sacrifice, it's a huge thing. My partner knows when he gives me things that I really love receiving them, and also that I'm going to honour him in having given to me. That's a big thing as well.
Thank you so much, Heather. They were some lovely and insightful tips. And if you want more information on Heather Belle Murphy and the secrets to long-lasting love, go to her webpage on our website, healthwellbeingandlifestyle.com.au. That is the end of our show. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you next week.
If you'd like to know more about our show, please like us on Facebook, follow us on Instagram, and subscribe to our YouTube channel.